Welcome to the weekend. I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute, and your devil's advocate tonight. A look at investigative journalism from the Denver Post, formerly of the editorial page, but you lost your job there, Chuck Plunkett. so glad you landed on your feet. And from the Independence Institute, from Independence Investigates, Todd Shepherd, glad to have you.
John, glad to be here.
You do some radio sometime, don't you?
Occasionally,
yeah.
I'm fortunate enough to do some radio from time to time.
That's great. All right, let's talk a little bit about, first of all, your move. And it seems as though the Post has done a switch up with the cards. I think every 3 years or so, Dean Singleton takes out all of his player cards, throws them up in the air, and reshuffles them. And now you've gone from the editorial board back to the newsroom where you were years ago, but you're focusing in on investigation. What's the story?
That's correct. Greg Moore, the editor of the Post, and the other editors asked a lot of us, it was newsroom-wide, to fill out a certain questionnaire and whatnot about how to use the resources that we've got the most effectively, because we've seen a lot of downsizing in our industry.
Hadn't noticed.
So I think we're trying to replace 100 youfolks over the years. So, it was time for a change. And the result for me is that, yeah, you're right, I left the editorial board where I'd been for a couple years, and I'm doing political investigative reporting, which is
you're like the one liberal on the editorial board that could use a calculator. This made you a rare commodity and somebody we could actually talk to.
Actually, I just had the book Math Tools for Journalists,
right.
Heavily dog-eared.
The big sign, caution, journalists doing math. All right, but now you've been replaced by a much more competent liberal, of course, and that
Mike Litwin is moved back to the
editorial page. Tell me about your new role on the news side. You're not going to be a beat reporter. You're not going to cover City Hall or the legislature. What exactly are you going to do?
It'll be a little bit different for the Post. It's not different for some newspapers around the country. It's a political watchdog beat, which can be as wide or as narrow as it needs to be at any given time. So I will try to focus on Colorado government and Colorado politics from a watching for scandal, watching for poor management of taxpayer money type role, political watchdog type role.
We'll have plenty to talk about. We'll have plenty to talk about. Now, I hired you a couple years ago to kind of fill a void that seemed to be happening in the mainstream media, which was the kind of stuff that Chuck is now getting back into. Looking at it, tell me a little bit about Independence Investigates. What is it you do?
Well, sure. I mean, I'm essentially on the same beat, you would say, as Chuck is. It's just investigative reporting, and rather than sort of throwing the wide net and looking at, maybe corporate investigative reporting or environmental investigative reporting, I don't look at those things, and I focus almost exclusively on government. And you're right, a couple of years ago, as the real heavy layoffs and a lot of the consolidation was going on, especially on the print side of journalism, there was this thought that if institutions like the Independence Institute don't hire investigative reporters, then that whole niche might be lost in sort of the whole journalistic picture. But all of that happens. Of course, we're talking about this in Colorado, where things are far more different than they are in any other state. So where the investigative reporting environment is a lot more mature, and one of those reasons why I think is because of the Colorado Democracy Alliance and sort of the political pressures that they put on Colorado over the years.
So in other words, a left-leaning organization that helps make sure that there's other investigative reporters and watchdogs out there. And I think that's a good thing,
right,
both on the left and the right, because we want to find out what's going on in government. Talk to me about the business of investigative journalism. Now, reporters love what you guys do. I mean, this is the height of it. Everybody wants to be Woodward. They want to go out there. They want somebody in jail by the end of the week. But it's expensive because you've got to spend a lot of time investigating. It's like fishing. You might not come up with anything. It's kind of intimidating, isn't it?
It is intimidating. I feel a lot of pressure. You get a role like this, and to whom as much is given, much is expected. And the reality is, unless someone calls up with a great tip and knows where the body is buried and can help you get there right away, a lot of times tips are vague, or they're estimated guesses, or you on your own are doing enterprise type work where you think, something about that seems a little fishy. I'll ask some questions and I'll dig in. Invariably, that leads to a bit of a skirmish over what documents you're going to get to look at, or which people you're going to get to talk to, and how willing they are going to be to trust you and whatnot. And sometimes that leads to a good story, a decent story. Sometimes it leads to nothing at all, to show for maybe 2 weeks worth of work.
Same thing is true on television news. And they've got those periods called ratings, sweeps. And so they're really after it to, we're going to have a big story, but we're going to break it next week. Newspapers and internet journalism is a little different. You're not under that same sort of, we got to break the story next week and not 2 weeks from now.
No, but certainly, I mean, just as Chuck said, to whom much is given, much is expected. And being an investigative reporter, even though I'm not working for a major daily or for a television station, I still have to get if I got anything less than a solid story out per month, I would feel, that I wasn't producing enough. For the TV side of it, though, it works perfectly for them in terms of the way sweeps are structured, because it does take, some stories take 2 months, 6 months, 8 months, and so they can always manage, the old vaudeville guy that would keep 10 plates spinning on a little pole. That's what all investigative reporters have to do. You got to get 7 or 8, maybe more than a dozen stories going, and then they'll produce slowly, bit by bit, and that's what you've got to do.
For instance, talk to me a little bit so we can put some meat on these bones. The report you did when Governor Ritter's cabinet wasn't filling out their affidavits, that they needed to put out some sort of financial disclosure. You really didn't mean to find that, but explain the story and what happened afterwards.
Well, yeah, I got it, and Chuck was talking about tips, and I have to sort of manage my investigative reporting on a different level than Chuck does, because obviously with the Denver Post letterhead behind him, that will certainly encourage more tips than I'm likely to get, than I can advertise for via Independence Institute. But it was a tip. Someone came to me and they said, you should look into this particular cabinet member of Governor Ritter. And they said, start off with the financial disclosure. And I didn't even know that cabinet members had to file them. And it was only because of an executive order. So I didn't want the Ritter administration to know that I was investigating this particular cabinet member. I said, show me the financial disclosures for all of your cabinet members. And that's when they came back to me and said, well, we only have the disclosure for our chief of agriculture.
They went back and said, what?
Right.
We're supposed to fill out what?
Right.
And so basically, Ritter had to scramble and say, hey, bad move on our side. We don't have these filled out for the last several years. And that was a real embarrassment. After that, we found out that one of his cabinet members was getting $30,000 a year from an advocacy organization, which he needed to give back as well. So the story kept going, and all you did was ask, and you didn't know the story. Interestingly, and I'll use this as my usual rip on the Denver Post, when Owens was in office, those forms were looked at pretty regularly every year when they were filled out. When Ritter was there, it seemed to have fallen in between the cracks, where there was that time where there was a big cut in reporters, and you guys weren't asking for those year after year. It was 3 years before we asked for them. And that's what you miss when you don't have an investigative reporter. So we're thrilled that the Post is doing this.
Was that a question?
No. I was just waiting for you saying, yeah, we were asleep at the wheel.
Well, I was on the editorial page.
Oh, okay, I got that.
Look, I'll jump in here and say that I am thrilled that the Post is doing this, and because, when I first talked to Chuck about when he announced that this was going to happen, it really is an issue of branding and soliciting tips. And if you watch a good investigative report on Channel 7 or Channel 9, they always tag it at the very end. The anchor looks at the camera and says, we learned about this tip from one of our viewers like you. If you'd like to send us news tips, and that's very effective. And so now there is literally this advertised avenue for readers of the Post to take their tips to the Denver Post. And that doesn't mean that people that are seen to be advocate journalists, maybe like myself, that I still won't get tips. If there's anything I learned from Peter Boyles in my time at Clear Channel, is people like to take tips to reporters that they feel think like them. And so because I work for the Independence Institute, that guarantees that I'm still going to get a steady stream of tips. Won't be as steady as the Post, but because that branding is going to pay off.
Because investigative journalism requires on tips, aren't a lot of the tips just people who have gripes? It's like, I can't believe they built this thing in my backyard, and I just know there's a lot of waste there.
There's going to be some of that. There's going to be some folks who call in who probably are well-intentioned, but